this is the third lecture of my lesson 4, which is on socialization and social interaction. We start off talking about socialization, socializing agents, then the origin and development of the sense of self, which is hugely important. And then we got into the first theory of social interaction, which is Erving Goffman's dramaturgical theory. Pretty basic stuff. Then we started the second theory of social interaction, which is Peter Blau's exchange theory. Also recall that we will talk about network theory, social influence, social reality, and the dominant mass perception. Okay, so we started with this yesterday, and we got to the point where we're talking about methods of turning the tables. When you lack power in exchange, how can you turn the tables? And in this case, we're focusing specifically on oil. Back in the 70s, both 73 and 79, there were two big oil shocks, which increased the price of oil 12 times over within 6 years. That's a huge increase. And each time was a big hit upon U.S. economy, but also the world economy. All right. Then we said there's 5 means of turning the tables: finding alternative sources, eliminating or reducing your need for that commodity, find an alternative commodity to replace it that sufficiently satisfies the function, acquire something the other person needs to increase your bargaining power in exchange, and the last one is to create within the other person a need for something you already possess. Right? And we said that this is going to be controversial. Use conflict and war to create demand for the weapons you manufacture. Also use divide and conquer in the Middle East to bust OPEC. Recall that the director of the CIA, Admiral Woolsey, who's actually a member of the board of Genie Energy now, said that destroying OPEC should be a first priority of those in government. Okay. Right. So now, how was this done? But let's get an understanding of this. We'll do overview of the history of the oil industry, and then the history of U.S. involvement in the Middle East. Okay, so I say here, quick history of U.S. actions in the Middle East, all the crazy stuff we did that makes sense within the framework of exchange theory. It's like, okay, that makes sense. If you don't believe any of it, look it up yourself. All right. As another note, whenever you see the word whenever you see red or nationalized, it means that Western nations, a corporation, an oil company by a Western nation, which developed foreign oil production, for example, in Iran or anywhere where foreign oil is produced, right, outside Western industrial nations. It was developed by those nations, but then they nationalized it, took control of their oil back for themselves, right? So, and you'll see that, okay, in all these cases, Soviet oil was actually developed by the Nobel family, Nobel Peace Prize. What were they famous for? Making gunpowder or cordite or something? I don't know. Mexican nationalized oil. Okay, on and on and on. And you see all these countries nationalizing the oil. By 1980, pretty much all of foreign oil was nationalized, right? Which means the control of foreign oil was out of Western hands, right? Okay, by 1980. So, quick history of the oil industry. The first significant oil well was discovered in 1859 with the Drake well at Titusville, Pennsylvania. So, USA, Pennsylvania was the birth of the oil industry. A year later, you came up with the first effective internal combustion engine. This thing here looks pretty clumsy and inefficient, but it worked. All right. So with the internal combustion engine, this began the path towards increased demand for oil. All right. So oil was originally used for kerosene lamps, right, for lighting. This is before the days of electricity. All right. And the oil that was used prior to you know, you know, oil, kerosene extracted from crude oil, was whale oil. Right here's a picture of Moby Dick. Right, you know, you got to hunt the whale and melt down its blubber for oil. All right. Then in 1886, the first gasoline automobile was produced. There it is, right there. That's the first one. And this is represented the increased demand for oil at a time when electric lighting was starting to kick in. Electricity was kicking in, right? You know, you had Alexander Graham Bell inventing, you know, better light with a bell. Yeah, a better light bulb, and you know, reducing the need for kerosene lamps, right? So this was dropping off, but this was picking up here. Then in 1903, here in Dayton, Ohio, you had the Wright brothers, and they developed the first, you know, airplane. But that was at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, where they flew it. They increased the demand of oil, and then in 1907, a guy named Leo Hendrik Bakelin invents Bakelite, which is the first commercially successful plastic from oil. And remember we said that what isn't made from oil? So the vast majority of products that we use are made from oil. Why? Because oil is made of hydrocarbons, and carbon, like we said, is the most versatile element. It can bond in so many different ways. It can bond covalently, making molecules with just about anything. Right? So it's serves as the backbone framework for molecules. Then in 1911, you had a clear. Well, I believe the realization of the strategic value of oil came before this, but this is where it's clearly implemented policy. The realization that the future of commercial shipping and warships will be fuel oil boilers driving steam turbines. All right. So I want to review first the idea of mercantilism. All right, it's centered around the idea of arbitrage, which is the old classic example. The key way of accumulating and acquiring concentrated wealth was through, you know, commerce, trade, shipping. All right, so trade, arbitrage, commerce. Right, that is a key source of wealth in nations, especially for a resource-poor nation like Great Britain. All right, they have few resources within their own country. Right. Yet they became the most powerful nation in the world for a good amount of history. So this becomes a source of wealth, which is the basis of national power, and it's the means by which you build your military power, both naval and ground forces. Right? This requires a military industry, and that military industry actually feeds back into wealth production. And then you need the naval and ground forces are used to control both territory, resources, and the shipping lanes necessary to support this trade and commerce. All right, and this became the source of national wealth and national power. Right, so this is all strategic stuff here. What do I say here? Why was Britain the dominant world power? Well, because for centuries they controlled the shipping lanes. They had the most powerful navy. Right, and they're the first to realize and to implement a shift towards oil-powered steamships. Prior to this, it was coal-powered steamships. All right, so why is that important? Okay, so let's see here. In 1911, Winston Churchill becomes the first Lord of the Admiralty and agrees with a fellow named Admiral John Fisher, who was a big proponent of oil. Powered ships, and who believed that the future of naval power is in oil. So with that, Britain needed to control Persian Gulf oil. Persian Gulf oil was discovered. The first well was hit in 1908. That was at Darcy. I think that fellow's name was Darcy, who discovered it there, who got the first concessions. Now, why is steam better? Well, because one, you have closed boilers, and with closed boilers, you can have four-strap blowers, right, which pump in a lot more air, which means more oxygen, which means burning cleaner and hotter, which results in higher steam temperatures and pressures, which results in faster ships. Now, faster ships were important, especially in a day when in order for ships to engage in combat, they had to come in within gun range, right? and the faster the ship, the better they can maneuver. Once carriers came in, then you can attack each other out of line of sight. And now, oil has twice the thermal content per volume than coal, so that gives you longer range, and that gives you less dependence upon less need for overseas bases for coaling stations, and to maintain these stations is costly and also vulnerable. If another nation wants to attack you, well, you cut your lines of logistical support. You take that coaling station, right? Then you don't have power projection within that region. Underway refueling at sea is another advantage. If you run out of fuel, well, you just go to a tanker at sea and fill up again. You need less manpower. You need less men like hauling bags of coal. Instead, you just have a pump that pumps it through a pipe fast and, without any effort, human effort. With more concentrated energy density, you have less requirement for coal space, which means more space for munitions. Also, there's an issue of damage control buoyancy. So, for example, if you take a hit on one side of the ship and it starts to fill up with water and it's listening to that side, well, what you can do is you can pump oil from that side to the other side to balance out the buoyancy. All right, so let's take look at some pictures to explain these concepts. First one here, we said that oil has twice the energy content of coal for the same amount of volume. All right. Two, we said that you don't need all these men to haul bags of coal, right? You just have a pump, right? It'll pump it, automatically. And then three, we said that with coal, you need these open furnaces because you have to keep it open and keep pumping in coal, shoveling in coal. You have these stokers here, all right? Now, because you have an open furnace, you cannot have forced draft. If you try to blow an extra air to get more oxygen so your coal burns cleaner and brighter and hotter, right? Well, that air is just going to blow out here and it's going to fry this guy. It's literally going to cook this guy fast, right? So you can't do that. With fuel oil, which you pump in with a pump, you can have a closed boiler. You have a forced draft blower that comes through here, and I think it preheats the air coming in. And of course, it's like a turbocharger or supercharger in a car, right? You just pump in more air, more oxygen, and you have better combustion, right? Also, you have higher temperatures, which give you higher steam pressures. Higher steam pressures allow, it provides for faster shifts, but it allows you to push more complicated propulsion engines like these here. This is a steam engine, a steam turbine, right? You have two stages, a high pressure stage and a low pressure stage, and the technology prior to this were reciprocating piston engines, and usually I think the max was about 3 stages where you pump in steam here, pushes the piston down, right? Goes back up and it pumps out the steam. That steam goes into another piston and powers another piston, and then a third piston, and then that steam is exhausted, all right? So you capture the energy in 3 stages. Now, with these steam turbines, you capture energy at every single turbine blade stage. So you can see that there's many, many stages all along here. And at each stage, you capture a fraction of the energy within that steam, right? Until by the end, you basically sucked out almost all the energy. And the last stages of a steam turbine are actually operating not at high pressure, not at like 800 psi or whatever. They're operating at a vacuum, all right, less than atmospheric pressure. And basically they're being powered by being sucked out, right? The vacuum created within the condenser. All right, so this is how you have to carry the coal, very, difficult, clumsy, right? Higher steam pressures allow for higher speed, and with higher speed, it was critical at a point when all naval combat involved maneuver. Right, so here's an example of enemy forces, 3 enemy ships. These are your ships, right? You want to gain the advantage. What you want to do is maximize your concentration of weapons upon them, right? And you do that by crossing the T. And to do something like this, you need to have superior maneuverability, and that comes with higher speed, all right? So crossing the T, you line up all your guns, get a full broadside, and you cause more damage. All right, so this is underway replenishment. You can't do this with coal. You can't be like hauling bags of coal one by one. Here, you just send over a line and just pump it across. All right, this is a fuel tanker. All right, and you refuel the ship here. And an example of battle damage. This is an actual attack. This is a U.S. ship, the USS Stark, which was damaged back in 80, was it 87, 86? Anyways, we'll get to that. And it's listed in the port, so with this damage, you can compensate for the additional water taken on here by taking fuel oil on this side, pump it into tanks on the starboard side over here, the right side. All right, so those are some advantages of fuel oil, and it's strategic, right? The British were the first to realize the strategic oil advantage of oil. The British were the preeminent strategic thinkers, and that's why they dominated for such a long time. Okay, so in June 1913, the British cabinet agrees with Winston Churchill that the government should acquire a controlling interest in trustworthy sources of supply, and they decided to become a shareholder in Anglo-Persian oil. So the British government became an owner within a private company, right? And the Admiralty subsequently acquired a 20-year contract on fuel oil, cheap fuel oil out of Iran. All right, 1914 to 1918 was World War I, and this proved the strategic value of oil, right? It was fully realized. For example, the advantage of trucks over trains. Now, trains at the time could have been fuel oil, but they're largely coal still. But the advantage of trucks over train is the flexibility of maneuver. Trains can only go where there's tracks. I mean, that's not where your armies are necessarily, right? And this creates difficulty in logistical support, right? But if you have trucks, those trucks can go wherever there's roads, or even where there's no roads, so long as the terrain is passable. So more flexible maneuver advantage, vast increase in oil consumption with World War I. With you have tanks here, the start of tanks. You have aircraft, you have trucks, and you have whatever. Okay, now, post-World War I, at the end of World War I, U.S. leaders feared depletion of U.S. oil reserves, right, which was largely Pennsylvania. And President Wilson demands a stake in Iraqi oil at the Paris Peace Conference. Secretary of State Lansing also pushed hard for a stake in Middle East oil. So we're worried. We're thinking, oh my goodness, we're going to run out of oil. Why? Because oil was largely just in Pennsylvania at the time, right? Now, in 1920 was the first nationalization of oil. The Soviet Union nationalized their oil, which was in Baku, which is on the western coast of the Caspian, right, and currently Azerbaijan. This came on the heels of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, November 1917, and so the communists nationalized the oil. All right, 1920 to 1943, fears of depleted U.S. oil were eased by big oil discoveries in Texas, Oklahoma, which Oklahoma is right over here, right, and in California where there was oil discovered. All right, there was big discovery in like 1930s in Texas. All right, U.S. oil at this point in time was approximately 70% of world production. So we're the big oil producers, all right, by the 1930s. So this is depicted in a rather comprehensive book on the oil industry called The Prize by Daniel Yergin in his chapter 11 called Shortage to Surplus. All right, 1938, Mexico nationalized its foreign oil companies. Right, same year, SoCal, which is Standard Oil of California, one of the subsidiary companies that were formed after the breakup of Standard Oil. What was it, like 1911 or something like that, right? Antitrust legislation broke it all up, and they discovered Saudi oil. So Saudi oil was discovered back in 1938. All right, 1943, the U.S. makes a 50-50 deal with Venezuela, right? So Venezuela was threatening to nationalize their oil, right? And to kind of stave off this revolutionary, threats type of thing, right? They're going to nationalize their oil. The FDR administration pushed the oil companies to give a 50-50 deal with Venezuela to avert any revolutionary movements and their nationalization of oil, like what occurred in Mexico. So they didn't want to repeat of Mexico. And they believed, Ickes was Secretary of Interior Ickes was a big part of this. He believed that the 50-50 split of profits between the oil companies will be seen by both nations, by the U.S. oil company and the host nation as, a good, even, fair number, right down the middle, right? So it'll be acceptable. Now, this would have repercussions later, as we'll see, because other countries would start to demand this. Now, 1939 to 1945, you had World War II. World War II was a huge demand on oil, big oil consumption during that war. It was a highly mechanized war. Okay, so high wartime oil consumption brings renewed fears of U.S. depletion. In 1945, February 1945, FDR makes a deal with Saudi royal family, fearing that, we're going to run out of oil, which we were going to. And he makes a deal with them saying, hey, we'll keep you in power if you ensure a reliable source of oil. Remember that the Saudi oil was discovered in 1938. All right, so this marks the start of big U.S. involvement in the Middle East, and the bottom line is we're going to need foreign oil, coming up pretty soon here. So then in 1951, this is a little bit down the line over here, right? The United States military training mission to Saudi Arabia was established, and we pretty much ran and commanded their internal security for a good period of time until we transferred it over to them. All right. Now, 1941, so this is at the start of our involvement in the war. This is actually before we got involved, before December 7th. Ickes, Secretary of Interior Ickes, said, quote, "It would truly be ironical if the United States, having set the pace in industrialization by the use of oil," right, which he's saying that, listen, our industrialization was founded upon oil, right? It was the backbone of our industrial and economic growth. Should be outdistanced by Germany, right? So he's saying oil is the basis of industrial economies and industrial growth. Now, this is my opinion, right? And I believe it was Ickes as well. With oil, if you control oil, and what he's talking about here, what he's actually talking about here is the situation in October 1916 was this. In June of 1941, the Germans launched their Operation Barbarossa, attacking the Soviet Union, and a key prize for their attack was Soviet oil in Baku, the Azerbaijan oil near the Caspian, right? And Ickes said that, right? And then Ickes said, hey, well, what's right below that? Iran, all the Iranian oil, all the British Persian oil. And then what's just west of there? Iraq and all the Iraqi oil, both with proven oil reserves, right? And then he said, they're going to have the lion's share of the world's oil, right? Now, with the lion's share of the world's oil, they're going to become the commercial, they'll have commercial supremacy. And with that, they can acquire military supremacy, right? And that was the key strategic problem of World War II, was a threat of not only a military aggressive Germany gaining this, right, but Nazi Germany, right? Germany as itself is very resource poor, right? If they acquired this, and all the other resources, the mineral resources of the Soviet Union, they could have been a problem. 1950, the U.S. negotiates a 50-50 deal with Saudi Arabia Aramco. So remember the 50-50 deal up here? Venezuela? Well, they make one with Saudi Arabia, right? The problem was, what's right across the Persian Gulf from Saudi Arabia? Well, Iran, right? So they get a 50-50 deal. Now, Aramco is a joint company between 4 U.S. companies, Standard of New Jersey, Standard of California, Saucony, and Texaco, right? And they're running Saudi Arabia oil. They own Saudi Arabia oil, basically. They developed it. but we're going for a 50-50 deal. Now, in 1951, largely due to the 50-50 deal given to the Saudis, Mossadegh, the Iranian prime minister, who was actually under a lot of domestic political pressure to push this, and I'm sure he wanted it himself, but he pushes a bill passed by the Iranian parliament to nationalize Anglo-Iranian oil. So once they nationalize it, they take control of it for themselves. The Iranians gain and maintain control of their own oil and facilities. And the idea here, I put the concept of relative deprivation. Well, the relative deprivation is right across the pond, right across, the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia is getting a fat 50-50 deal, whereas the Iranians are getting about 16.5% from the British, right? And they weren't even allowed to look at the books, to inspect the books, to see if they're really getting this 16.5%, right? So now, at the time, not only did Saudi Arabia have a 50-50 deal, but also Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela, right? So the Iranians are saying, well, why not us, right? If you don't want to negotiate, well, screw you. We'll take back our oil. And that's what they did. All right, but in 1953, the U.S. CIA and the British MI6, the MI6 is like the foreign intelligence group, like the CIA here, they conduct a coup. They overthrow the Iranian Prime Minister, Mossadegh, there's Mossadegh, right, and install a dictator, Shah of Iran, this guy right here. So they install this guy. Now the Shah is corrupt and brutal. He uses his secret police, the Savak, to terrorize the Iranian people, utilizing torture, assassinations, executions, a lot of arrests without due process. There's absolute evidence of U.S. involvement in the coup, with documents being released, right? And I give you some examples in my lesson number 7, which is on government and mass movements. One was Kermit Roosevelt wrote a book in this. This was a book, however, written largely for public consumption. He was a CIA station chief. He was Teddy Roosevelt's grandson. He was CIA station chief in Iran. He wrote a book chronicling the Operation Ajax. A better document is Dr. Wilbur's, because he was the chief planner of the coup himself. He was the chief planner, and he was tasked to write the official internal CIA history of it for their records and for their training, right? This has been declassified and released according to the Freedom of Information Act, and I've read this thing. It also includes the British plan for the same thing, which is basically virtually identical with America, because they were in close coordination. Now, typically we overthrow foreign governments when our economic interests are threatened. Examples of democracies we have overthrown and replaced with dictators. Well, Iran is one of them. We overthrew them for oil. They nationalized oil, and so we overthrew their democracy and put it in the Shah. Chile, copper was nationalized, the copper industries, so we overthrew their president and installed a dictator, Pinochet, who was pretty brutal, and he was being hunted down for crimes against humanity. Guatemala, key thing there was agriculture, United Fruit and Agriculture. He was running a program on land redistribution, right? Unused lands owned by United Fruit, right? How did they acquire it? Well, in kind of shady ways. And so he's redistributing land. He also had some tax reforms, right? And he was overthrown, replaced by a guy named Armas. All right. So 3 democracies overthrown and dictators installed. Now this is very, recall neocolonialism. This is right along the line of neocolonial patterns, where we install a dictator who we can control. So why we overthrow democracies? Well, what is it? If you have a democracy and it's popular, a person is popularly elected, all right. Well, they're gonna promote policies which benefit them, right? And possibly to the detriment of U.S. corporations who are trying to control the economies and all the resources over there, right? So you have an election. They could be they're usually nationalistic. They're always nationalistic, right? Which is us first. We're going to support our agenda, right? Why? Because people are selfish, right? Of course they're going to support their agenda, right? what's in their best interest. And they could be Republican, they could be, social democratic, all right? They're always nationalistic. They could be socialist or they could be communist. But in all cases, we labeled them just across the board communist, right? And we took actions against them, rationalized, justified by anti-communism, right? Became a rationalization. All right. So now, in the case of Iran, what was the real threat? Was the threat nationalizing Iranian oil, or was it a broader threat? I believe it was broader. All right. So here's Iran. Well, this is a cartoon by a guy named I think his name is Jim Unger. Anyways, it's called The Far Side, and in this, you have this guy here cooking his food with a stick, and you have these guys cooking the food, but holding their meat into the fire, and they're burning their hands, and you can see like they're in pain, whatever, right? And this guy says, "Hey, look what Zog do," right? But in the case of oil, it's like here's this guy. He's like, I'm so happy I nationalized my oil. This is Iran, right? All the other colonized nations around the world, not just oil nations, but any colonized nation, right, around the world can take a look at Iran and say, hey, look what they did, right? They nationalized his oil. So they're going to say, we're going to nationalize our stuff, right? And then you got a big problem, right? It's going to create a wave of nationalization, and then whatever corporations which are dominating and controlling foreign resources are going to lose out, right? So the idea is you got to nip it in the bud early, right? You got to squash this to discourage, movements to nationalize the resources around the world, right? And unfortunately, a big part of the Cold War was about this, right? It was preventing what's called decolonization, right? All the colonies that were developed, especially during the 19th century, vying for independence, vying for control of their own economic destinies and their own resources, right? Were threatening to go independent, and that couldn't be allowed. Okay, so that was a big threat. That was the real threat. That's why this had to be done, right? Can't allow an example of this to occur because that would just encourage more. But as we said, nationalization occurred anyways, all right? Down the line, right? It happened anyways. Now, in 1956, geologist M. King Hubert published his paper on peak oil theory, and he predicted that U.S. oil reserves will reach their peak production in 1970, and he turned out to be correct. This is his prediction, and this is actually the actual data on it, right? Is pretty much following exactly his curve, right? And let's see here. It's starting to fall off, but you see the little bump there? It's probably when Alaskan oil kicked in, right? So that helped what can I say, buffer or temper the fall of oil production. Now this is fracking kicking in. This was hitherto, the development of slant drilling technology and hydraulic fracturing. This oil was inaccessible, right? We have huge reserves of this tight oil. It's slate rock oil, right? We couldn't get to it until we developed fracking, but now this has been a big source of production, and now we're above the peak at 70. We're actually the largest oil producers in the world right now. Okay, so in 1960, 5 nations joined together to form OPEC, right? It's now 14 nations, and OPEC is an oil cartel, right? Now, the formation of this was kind of in the conceptual phase for a long time. It was patterned after 3 U.S. oil cartels that were allowed to exist back in the 1930s when there was like really aggressive competition for oil production, price, struggle to gain access to markets and so forth, right? And oil prices plummeting, right? To the point where oftentimes the oil price made it insufficiently profitable, right? To ship it to market. So often the oil was dumped into streams and so forth, right? Creating both, environmental hazards, but also just wasting a precious U.S. resource. So to control this production, to control the competition, 3 cartels were authorized during the FDR administration. One was the Texas Road Commission, another one was in Oklahoma, another one was in California, the 3 main regions for U.S. oil production. All right, now based upon those examples, they were studied by these, OPEC people, and they developed their cartel based on that. And it was triggered actually by a recession in the 1950s and fall of oil prices. And I'm not going to get into that. So now concentrated supply power for oil-producing nation. So this concentrates their power. All right, OPEC basically controls about 40% of the world's oil production as a single entity. So that's significant. OPEC is a cartel. Now, if it were in the United States, then the Department of Justice would bust it up, just like the Teddy Roosevelt trust busting, right? But we don't have jurisdiction in the world, right? We don't have worldwide jurisdiction, so we can't bust it up. So how do we bust OPEC? How do we do what Director of the CIA, Woolsey, said we must do? Must destroy OPEC, right? Why must we destroy OPEC? Well, he said, what did he say? He said it threatens our economic viability, our national security, and the stability of many nations around the world. All right, so you got to bust it up, right? And another way of looking at it is this: when you have trust, they can control price, which is a monopoly power. They get together as a large group, and all the companies agree to production limits, right? They reduce production, which they can jack up price and maximize their profits, right? But as price goes up, that means input costs go up for other, whether it's consumers, but other businesses, other manufacturers trying to stay in business and be competitive. So what this does is this destroys their competitiveness. So if they're trying to compete on a world market, for example, well, this is hurting U.S. companies. So you got to bust these trusts in the United States, all right? But how do we bust an international cartel? That's a different problem altogether. All right, so here you have Cuba nationalizing oil, you have Indonesia nationalizing oil. Then in 1961, Qassim, who's prime minister in Iraq, tries to invade Kuwait, right? And this is blocked by the British. Let's see if we got a picture here. I'll show you a picture of, so here's Kuwait, here's Iraq. Qassim tries to invade Kuwait. So that's pretty much what Saddam Hussein attempted to do about 30 years later, right? In 1990, he invaded. It was August 1990. Then in 1962, you have Burma nationalized oil, Algeria nationalized oil, Sri Lanka, right? And then you got a whole wave kicking in here. All these, and this wave here was one factor in making this possible was the major oil companies. There weren't that many at the time that were developing overseas oil, right? Anglo-Iranian, Royal Dutch Shell, Gulf Oil, Standard Oil, California, Standard Oil, New Jersey, big one, Standard Oil, New York, right? And Texaco. These were the big oil companies. 4 of them were American. Oh no, 5 of them American, right? One was Dutch and Anglo-Iranian. Actually, Dutch. This was largely shareholders. Big shareholders in this there were big British shareholders and also U.S. shareholders, right? And this is British oil, right? So what happened was there was emergence of these independent oil companies, right? Smaller, whatever you call them, startup companies, and they had the know-how and technology to pump oil. So these nations made contracts with these guys and said, hey, listen, we'll nationalize oil. If we make a deal with you, if you give us a better deal in production. And of course, these guys gave them a better deal than the big oil companies, right? And so they nationalized their oil. Right, and it was largely made possible by the emergence of these independent oil production companies. 1963, Qassim, the prime minister of Iraq, nationalizes Iraqi oil. He's then overthrown in a coup, reportedly to have been backed by the U.S. and Britain, although I haven't tracked down documents to prove this, so I can't say I have an opinion. But there is solid evidence that the U.S. CIA backed the 1959 coup and Saddam Hussein during that. Then you have all these countries nationalizing oil: Argentina, Ghana, Brazil, Peru, Algeria. All right. And then in 1970, as predicted by Hubert, right, U.S. oil production peaks at 9.6 million barrels per day. Right. After that, it's all downhill. This little bump up there is Alaskan oil. The pink area is Alaskan oil, and the green there is tight oil. You know, the fracking oil. It says they're tight. Kicked in about 2010 and grew rapidly after that. Okay. The late 1960s and early 1970s were, for the most part, years of high economic growth. Oh, this is a quote actually from Daniel Yergin's book, the Prize. The late 1960s and early 1970s were, for the most part, years of high economic growth for the industrial world, and in some years, outright boom. All right, this growth is fueled by oil. All right, so again, you know, remember Icky said oil was the basis of economic growth, right? Industrial growth. And Daniel Yergin is repeating that. And that's true. We examined that. We examined that in this diagram here, right? How industrial economies depend upon transportation, right, for distribution of goods. Production is based upon distribution and accessing other markets. If you can't access markets, well, why are you going to produce it, right? So that drives production, all right? But it's dependent upon transportation, which requires oil in this state of technology. All right, so where are we at here? Okay, now 1971, Texas Railroad Commission sets pro-rationing at 100% production. This means the U.S. has no excess production capacity. This means the United States can no longer control price. We're pumping out as much oil as we can produce just to try to meet demand, and we're not even meeting our demand. Our economy, our consumption of oil has exceeded that, what we can produce. And that's only going to get worse as production falls off. Okay, where are we at here? Because we have to produce all we can just to meet demand. OPEC becomes the monitor of spare production, which means they control price, which means they hold monopoly power, right? The ability to control price. And then the net oil imports rose rapidly from 2.2 million barrels per day in 1967 to 6 million barrels per day, tripling by 6 years later in 1973. You know, both as a function of production falling off in the United States and increasing demand as our economies are growing. Our economy is growing. Imports as a share of total oil consumption over that same period rose from 19% to 36%. So doubled the percentage of oil consumed. Right. So we're 1/3 of oil, or over 1/3 of oil, is foreign oil. Indeed, the razor's edge was the ever-increasing reliance upon oil from the Middle East. That's, again, from the Prize, Daniel Yergin, right? And also in this year, we're suffering inflation. And Nixon had the Nixon shock in 1971, in which he got the United States dollar off the gold standard, and also he had wage and price freezes due to inflationary pressures. You know, the big sources of inflationary pressures were trying to fight the Vietnam War, a full-scale war, industrial production war, full-scale industrial production war. At the same time, we're doing the Great Society, you know, the war against poverty, the war in Vietnam, same time. There's no rationing, there's no cutbacks, right? And there's high demand, our economy's overheating, and that's causing inflation. It's causing scarcity of resources and goods. It's causing scarcity of labor, driving up wages. So with inflation, dollar value is falling, right? All right, but the thing about that was this is in the era of Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods was established in 1944. The Bretton Woods Conference, you know, to avoid the aggressive currency devaluation, and also the aggressive formation of contained and closed autarkic trading blocks, right? Two key factors that led to World War II. To avoid the recurrence of that, they established the Bretton Woods Agreement, in which all currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. All right, to create currency stability, and to facilitate the exchangeability of currencies one to another. All right. However, this agreement was based upon the agreement by all the member nations of maintaining their currency value within 3% par value with the dollar. All right. So now, what was happening was, as the United States economy was overheating and undergoing rampant inflation, that forced these other nations to devalue their currency. And to devalue their currency, they would have to, of course, print more of their bills, all right? And with those bills they printed, they had to purchase dollars off the market, right? So they're increasing demand for dollars. They're helping maintain dollar value, but at the same time, they're devaluing their own currency, purchasing dollars, holding them in reserve, dollars that are falling in value. So what this meant was, essentially, we're exporting inflation, and essentially we're exploiting our excessive deficit spending to other nations, and they're literally paying for our overspending. So they didn't like that, and what happened was some nations, I know France, and I know there was banking cartels, or not cartels, banking syndicates. Syndicates of large banks got together, and they started to basically cash in their chips, cash in their dollars for gold. Right now, this is at a point where with inflationary pressures on the dollars locked to gold, pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. But the real, due to the devaluation of the dollar, the real exchange between dollar and gold, the real gold value, was well above that. I forget exactly what it was. Maybe like $50, $60, $70, maybe $80. I don't know. So what they started doing is saying, well, screw this. We're just going to cash in our dollar for gold, right? So that resulted in a rapid depletion of the U.S. gold reserves, and then it became very critical. And Nixon said, we better get off this. So he got off it, and then we're now on the dollar is basically fiat currency. It's not based upon any real commodity. It's just based upon market value. All right. So let's see here. All right. So Libya nationalized oil, Iraq nationalized oil, Nigeria nationalized oil, Saudi Arabia negotiates for 25% control of Aramco. They'll get by 1980. They get 100% control. Libya takes 50% control of ENI, Italian state oil company. Iraq nationalizes the rest of its oil. Iran, having nationalized oil and facilities, take control of operations. Okay. So there's nationalization going on, further nationalization. 1973 was a critical event here. Arab-Israeli war, the Yom Kippur War. U.S. backs Israel. And what happened was this, right? After the 67 war, the 6-Day War, basically, the Arabs were like plotting their revenge from day one, right? Their next war, and they lost the 67 war. And when this war started, the Nixon administration, I read internal documents, internal discussions when this war occurred. First day, they're like laughing. Right? Like, Israel's going to kick their butts again. There's going to be another short war. They're expecting another 6-day war, right? But within a day, literally within a day, they're like saying, "Oh no, holy crap!" Right? Israel can go under, right? So there was emergency weapons transfers. A whole load of planes filled with weapons were flown over rapidly to keep Israel alive, basically, right? They're on the verge of going under as a nation, right? So we backed Israel, sent them a whole bunch of weapons and so forth, right? And then OPEC nations, the Arab nations, got all pissed off, and they retaliated by an oil embargo, right? So oil prices, with the big cut in supply, oil prices jacked up rapidly. They quadrupled, and this killed our economy. It was a big inflationary pressure. Prices remained high through 1979. Where they then went up further when you had the Iran Revolution and Iranian oil production was cut off, right? And prices tripled, right? But the key thing was, with this, oil was realized as an effective weapon. And spinning off as a result of this, oil was, it was realized that oil held the world's economy hostage, all right? Now, Libya nationalized its oil, 50% of those companies that had it nationalized already. All right, Qatar nationalizes oil. In June of 1974, Nixon establishes the petrodollar. So a big thing happening here. This oil embargo is really jacking up prices. All right, we said oil is key for every commodity, whether it's for transportation of goods, right, or as the building blocks for the synthetic chemical industry, right? So it's jacking up prices. There's strong inflationary pressure. Dollar value is falling. So Nixon establishes a deal with initially Saudi Arabia, then it spread to all OPEC nations, where he establishes the petrodollar. And what the petrodollar is based upon the agreement that these oil-producing nations sell oil exclusively for dollars, right? They only take dollars. So whoever buys it, let's say, I don't know, whoever, Iceland needs oil, right? Well, they better get some dollars, right? Or they're not going to get oil. All right. So what that does is that helps boost demand for the dollar, and with increasing demand, that helps to maintain dollar value, and that stems off inflation. So to stem inflation, but also they intended this to help recycle dollars back to the United States, to make availability of currency, to relieve pressure on interest rates. 1975, Kuwait nationalizes oil. Venezuela nationalizes oil. 76. Then 77, Alaska oil production begins, and North Sea production starts to become significant. So this helps a little bit, right? Not enough, but it's helping. Then in 1979, the Iranians finally overthrow the brutal, corrupt dictator, the Shah. This guy, he's overthrown, but this guy comes in power, the Ayatollah Khomeini. All right, who they see as a puppet for the United States. So that you can see how they hated this guy, right? Iranian oil production plummets, oil price increases 3 times. So with the combination of OPEC oil embargo and the Iran revolution, there's a 12-fold increase in price within 6 years. This kills our economy, causes something called stagflation. We talked about that last lesson briefly. U.S. gives the Shah asylum in the United States. He was sick. I believe he had cancer. Right? So we're like, okay, we'll give you asylum. Right? Well, the Iranian people didn't take that too kindly, and they said, we want him back. We want to put him on trial. So we said, no, I don't think so. We're not going to give him up. So they said, all right, we'll take your embassy. Well, they charged our embassy, and they took everyone hostage, and they said, we're going to use these people as leverage. We'll give them back if you give back the Shah. Well, we didn't give back the Shah, right? We don't trade for hostages. But the Reagan administration does. We'll get to that in a little bit. We hate Iran. Iran is our sworn enemy. All right. People hated it. I remember these days clearly. I mean, I was a kid, maybe in, 79. I was in junior high school. Yeah, I was in junior high school, maybe going into freshman year. But I was old enough to clearly remember this. And I remember how people, just average Americans, hated Iran so bad. Every night it's on the news with Nightline. And, day so-and-so, whatever, day 400, whatever, right? Iranian hostage thing, right? And I remember anyone who looked Iranian, they could be American Indian, they could be Indian or they could be from Pakistan, whatever, right? Or they could be from Saudi Arabia or whatever, right? They looked Iranian, right? You stood a chance of getting beat up on the streets. It was crazy. Anyways, so we hated Iran. Now Iran and Saddam Hussein become our Iraq and Saddam Hussein become our ally. Right. Well, we helped them already. Right. The CIA helped them in the '59 coup. Right. So we're aligning with Saddam Hussein. Right. And in 1980, Saudi Arabia takes 100% control of Aramco. All right. So it became a privately owned company, owned by the Saudi royal family. Right, out of U.S. control here. U.S. and Western nations have lost direct control of essentially all foreign oil at this point. They've lost direct control of the key commodity that drives industrial economy. All right. Now, in 1980, Iraq invades Iran. Let's see, Saddam has has a number of reasons, and one reason is a long-standing border dispute along the Shatt el-Arab waterway. So let me show you that real quick. All right. So here's the Shatt el-Arab waterway. Why is it important? Well, this is the waterway which Iraq ships out its oil through. The main port facilities are in Basra, where they fill their tankers, and the tankers come down the Shatt el-Arab waterway into the Persian Gulf, then through the rest of the world. Now, the Iranian oil production is at a place called Abadan, right here. Very similar, same idea as Basra, right? The Iranian tankers are filled up here. They come out here. Now, if Saddam's saying, well, the border between our states are on the eastern bank of the Shatt el-Arab waterway. What that means is he's claiming full control of that waterway. And what that means is Iran cannot use this waterway. So that's going to cut off Iran oil export, right? Now, you know, his real reason is whatever historical, basis for this or lack of basis, I don't know what it is, but you know what his motives are. He wants to cut out Iranian oil production, all right? Iran and Iraq are enemies, right? Yeah, that's his motive, So Iran, he claims also. So he said, well, the actual borders on the East Bank, right, which is on your shores, right. You have no access to that water, right. Is what he's saying, right. Iran's support for Shia and Kurdish insurrection. So within Iraq, there's a Shia, which is the majority group, but they're out of power, right? And there's Kurdish, population, right? And they want their independence, right? They want to vie for political power or whatever, right? So there's insurrection, and Saddam is claiming, I don't know if it's true or not, but he's claiming that Iran is supporting for them. I wouldn't doubt it. It's possible, right? But I don't know. But that's one of his claims. Now, I believe his true motive were the huge oil reserves in the Kurdistan province in western Iran, right? So where is Iranian oil, right? It's here. Here's the Shatt el-Arab waterway right there, right? This is where the oil is. This is Iranian oil. Here's Iraq, right? Saddam Hussein's making a grab for this oil. That's his prime motive. All right. Okay, there's also another factor was U.S. intelligence was given to Saddam, indicating that disputed territory along the Shatt el-Arab waterway, the border with Iran, could be taken by Iraq in a short offensive that will last only several weeks. Right? This is reported in a book by Dilip Hero, who was an investigative reporter who specialized on the Iran-Iraq war. Right? The Iraq offensive becomes an 8-year war, which results in well over 1 million estimated deaths. All right, so as I see the LP, I want to go through this. So here, the waterway border dispute would kill Iranian oil production short term because they can't ship it out until they build new port facilities and pipelines. You can conceivably see them building facilities to get a pipeline over here, maybe a port facility across here. I don't know, right? Some alternative port facility, giving Iraq the upper hand, but the benefit would be both limited and short term. Therefore, I believe, this is just my opinion, I believe Saddam's real goal was taking the Kurdistan's oil province. All this area here, which is Iranian oil. Iran's oil is right here, right? What would that do? That would kill Iran's economy, weakening them, who is Saddam's enemy. That would double Iraq's oil reserves. That would essentially double their production capacity. It would greatly increase Iraq's revenues, with which Saddam would purchase weapons, whacking the regional balance of power. So that would totally throw off balance the regional balance of power, creating a world security threat in a vital oil region, which is not good. It would give Iraq plenty of spare production capacity, far more than they need, right, for their own economy, right, allowing substantial cuts in production from the world economy, giving Saddam the ability to control price, raising price, which would be a detriment to the world economy, right? So for these reasons, that cannot be allowed, all right? That would be a bad thing. All right. Let's see here. Saddam Hussein is our ally. we supply them with weapons and support, but we're also at the same time throughout the whole war helping Iran. So we're fueling both sides of this war. All right. So what do we give to Saddam? Right. We gave him satellite intelligence on the movement of Iranian ground forces. Right. Here's a satellite. Right. We're feeding intelligence to them, where they're located and where they're moving. We're giving them AWACS early warning aircraft intelligence through Saudi-leased U.S. AWACS planes. These can basically track anything in the sky. All right. Highly sophisticated, complex electronic surveillance, platform here. We're supplying non-U.S. made foreign weapons, right, to Iraq. We're supplying dual-use items like the equipment and material to make chemical and biological weapons. We're supplying this stuff. I know that the Commerce Department fought against. No. The State Department fought against us, but the Commerce Department won over the Reagan administration, and so we're supplying all this stuff to make chemical weapons, the materials, and also the equipment to make chemical weapons. We're supplying them biological toxins. For example, in the Regal report, right, on the sale of dual U.S. dual items, right, there's I've read this, there's page after pages of toxins, all sorts of stuff, botulitum, anthrax, you name it, smallpox, and on and on and on, all sorts of different strains of it, just nasty stuff, right? We're selling it to them, and we're supplying dual use things like these Bell helicopters, right, which can be used for civilian purposes or military purposes. We also sold them ballistic missile technology. All right, this is during the Reagan administration's authorizing all this stuff. All right, Bell helicopters, yeah, that's the Bell helicopters there. All right, now Iran is our enemy, all right, and they're at war with our ally. But we supplied them with, throughout the whole war, the entire war from the day one, we're supplying them with F-14 and M-60 main battle tank repair parts. Here are F-14s, right? Iran got these when we're getting these, right? As soon as these came out in the 1970s, right, Iran was getting them, just as our Navy was getting them. And these are M-60 main battle tanks. This was our state-of-the-art tank back then, right? So we're keeping these flying, and we're keeping these running on the ground, right, through repair parts. Funneled through Israel, okay? And then in 1985, with the whole Iran-Contra debacle there, we sold them TOW anti-tank missiles. These are wire-guided missiles, very effective, very similar to the Soviet Malyutka wire-guided anti-tank rockets there, right? And these are Hawk surface-to-air missiles. The generation of missiles right before the Patriot. And these were very effective. Right? Both of these were effective missiles. So, we supply both sides of the war. Are we fueling the war? Are we extending the war? All right? There's a question to be asked here. Kill golden egg goose. What am I saying there? I can't remember there. All right, so now, that's what it is. Okay. So, OPEC backfired. By 1982, in the 1973, there was the embargo, and actually going back further, by 1971, OPEC becomes the monitor spare production, which means they control price, which means they have monopoly power, and they're jacking up price by restricting production, right? And with the embargo, and what happens is this OPEC strategy backfires by 1982. So they're restricting production. It's resulting in high oil prices. They're making big profits, big OPEC revenues, right? And there's big OPEC spending because of that. They believe they're always going to have a reliable source of demand for their product, and they're going to keep making money. So they spend big, right? Now, in the West, the high oil prices causes recession, causes downfall of the economy, right? And also at the same time, there's increased conservation methods, and there's a search for alternative fuels and energies, right? To some extent, and demand falls, especially due to the falling economy, right? Prices plummet as a result of that. Then OPEC, because prices plummet, OPEC is stuck with high debt and insufficient means to pay, right? So at this point now, debt is realized as a weapon, right? All the debt that we held on them is now a weapon. So what they did is, I guess what I'm saying here, they killed the goose that laid the golden egg. You know, the world economy is the goose that lays the golden egg, right? And they getting greedy, they killed that goose. Now, from the prize, Daniel Jurgens' book, The Crisis of Plunging Prices led to the international debt crisis, and many of the, quote, world-class international debtors would turn out to be oil nations, which had borrowed heavily on the premise that there would always be markets for their oil and at a high price. Well, that kind of fell through. Now, just as OPEC used oil as a weapon, debt became a weapon against them. All right, and you'll see that this became the key outcome in the first Gulf War, became a means of destroying OPEC. That'll become clear as we go along. Now, in 1985, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait overproduced oil above OPEC quota. Right, this is during the Iran-Iraq War, and they did this to drive down prices to lower Iranian revenues, conducting economic warfare on Iran. All right, I explained that in that big price of oil factor diagram. And also, they overproduced to get more revenue for themselves to help finance Iraq's war. You see, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia are all Sunni nations, and they supported Iraq, which had a Sunni government, the Ba'ath Party, in the fight against the main Shia government, which is Iran. Right, so they're overproducing oil to get more revenue, but it's driving down price, hurting Iran. At the same time, they're the one getting more money, which you can use to provide loans to Saddam to help finance his war effort. And because they're overproducing, oil prices plummet to, at one point, there was a spot price of $6 a barrel at one point in 1986, which is, I'm sure, cheaper than the oil price in the 1970s and 60s, because this is 1980s price, 1986 dollar value. All right. Okay. Okay. Bottom line here is, it is now clearly evident that the exigent needs of war can be efficacious at driving down oil prices. All right. 1985, we screw our ally, Saddam Hussein, Iraq, right, by giving Iraq false intelligence on the position of Iranian forces, while at the same time, the U.S., quote, this is from the Iran-Contra, Senate report in the Iran-Contra, the U.S. also provided the Iranians with military intelligence about Iraq, right? So we give them false intelligence, and we give Iran intelligence on Iraq, right? So we're helping Iran against our ally. Plus, with the Iran-Contra, we sold key weapon systems that were essential for a successful ground offensive. TOW anti-tank missiles and Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. All right. Also, from the start of the war, we sold around F-14 and M-60 repair parts. Now, the reason why these were important is, of course, anti-tank missiles are important to a ground offensive by taking out the key ground assets in mobile warfare, which are tanks. All right. And also, in the ground offensive, all right, it's essential to suppress your enemy air. If you don't control the air, right, if you can't suppress the enemy air, well, they're just going to fly in and whack everything on the ground. So that's why these Hawk anti-aircraft missiles were important, right? Okay, so air suppression is key because you can't allow the enemy to possess air superiority, or he'll just whack ground forces from the air, especially in an open field, conventional desert war. Yeah, so they're highly vulnerable there. It's not like there's jungle cover or anything like that. You know. Now, this was all exemplified in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Right? Remember we talked about that war here? In this war, key factors were Soviet wire-guided anti-tank missiles, similar to the TOW wire-guided anti-tank missile. Right? Proved very effective. And they had surface-to-air missiles, S2, SA-2 and SA-3s, I believe, were large missiles, but more mobile missiles with a 6 and 7. Right? Similar idea to the Hawk. Right? Now, during this, This is according to the Senate report on Iran-Contra investigation. Poindexter, who was Poindexter? He was National Security Advisor, I believe, right? Poindexter, in recommending to the president the sale of weapons to Iran, so he's pushing the sale of weapons to Iran to the president, right? Gave as one of the reasons that Iraq was winning the Gulf War. Now, that was not true. That assessment was contrary to the views of intelligence professionals at the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the CIA, who had concluded as early as 1983 that Iran was winning the war. So, unquote there, right? All right, so Iraq was not winning the war. Iran was winning the war. Yet we're giving weapons to Iran, furthering the imbalance. This proves that the motive of weapon sales was to affect the war, not by balancing it, but by increasing the imbalance against our ally, Iraq. And you've got to wonder why. Now, worsening the Iraq military position would increase Saudi and Kuwaiti oil sales to support Iraq and finance its war. And by 1985, Saudi-Kuwaiti overproduction was already causing oil prices to plummet. All right, so this is going to further benefit oil prices. Now, in 1986, January 1986, with the aid of false intelligence to Iraq, intelligence given to Iran, and the weapons sold to Iran, Iran launches a ground offensive that is highly successful and results in Iraq's loss of the Fall Peninsula, which is Iraq's only access to the Persian Gulf and the means by which they export oil. So this is what they lost. Here's the Fall Peninsula, right here, Al-Fa, right there. Right, there's the Chateau Arab waterway. They lost this. Without this, they have no means of exporting oil into the Persian Gulf. All right, so they're screwed. Without a means of exporting oil, Iraq can't finance its war. That's how you finance a war, right? Through the revenues that you acquire. What's their chief source of revenues? Oil. Oil export was 60% of the Iraqi economy. Now, if they lose that, are they left with 40%? No, because this 60% helps support this remaining 40%. So they're really screwed. It's a one-dimensional economy, and they've lost that, right? So now, in November of 1986, the Iran-Contra conspiracy is made public, right? Everyone knows the Reagan administration's illegal sale of weapons to Iran in exchange for our hostages and for money for the Contras. That's what was stated anyways, the cover story, right? Now, however, no matter how many promises the Iranians failed to keep on these hostages, right? Throughout this secret initiative, the arms sales continued to generate funds for the enterprise. Remember, the enterprise is the front company, just like Air America and Cargo Air Transport, for the CIA. This is the front company that's running finances and running guns and money for the Contras, based out of the National Security Agency, right? Or wasn't that? Well, it's a National Security Advisor. I guess it was a National Security Agency. Anyways, it wasn't the CIA, but it was directly controlled by the Reagan administration. All right, front company, enterprise. All right, so the idea is this. Here's what happened. We would make a deal to release hostages. Iran's holding some hostages, right? We say, okay, you release this hostage, and we'll sell you these arms. Well, we'd sell them a bunch of arms, right? And they wouldn't release the hostages. They would renege on their deal. They wouldn't release it, right? So what do? Well, we sell them some more arms, right? And again, they wouldn't release the hostages. We sell them more arms. Then we have deals where it's say, okay, you're going to release 3 hostages, and then maybe they release 1, right? And time after time, they kept doing this. They kept screwing America, right? And we kept selling them weapons, right? Now, first of all, you don't negotiate for hostages. If you deal for hostages, you make hostage-taking profitable, which only encourages more hostage-taking, right? So the common sense policy is you don't negotiate for hostages because it's just going to put more Americans at risk, right? So you don't do that in the first place. We did it, and then not only did we do that, we got screwed time and again. No matter how many times we were screwed, we kept selling arms, which gained funds for the hostage for the enterprise, right? Which is supposed to supply money to the Contras, right? Who were the Contras? They were the drug-dealing scumbags, right? Um, and what were they doing? They were selling those weapons that we got for them to make money, right? Uh, so most of these arms sales profits from the deals with the hostages would remain with the enterprise and never reach the Contras. So we're saying we're doing this for the Contras, yet most of the money stayed with the enterprise, right? Um, and the Reagan administration kept authorizing sales, right? So this is the Senate report on Iran-Contra, the Senate right here, right? Now, so there are cover stories. There's cover stories for these for the sales. One, oh, we're getting out the hostages. Yeah, we're getting screwed on the hostages. You keep selling it. Oh, we're helping the Contras. No, you're keeping the money, right? And what are the Contras doing when you get them weapons? They're selling the weapons to make money, right? Oh, Iraq was winning the war. No, they were losing the war. So these were all cover stories, all right? So why were we really still on hostages? I believe it comes down to the war was efficacious in lowering oil prices, maintaining that war, keeping Iraq with their back against the wall. Okay. All right. And then what happened was, so war is very efficacious in lowering oil prices. January of 1987, the Iraq Foreign Minister, Tariq Aziz, who is actually Saddam Hussein's right-hand man, he complains to the press that the key to the Iranian successful capture of Iraq's Fall Peninsula, and thus their loss of access to exporting oil, which is critical to Iraq, to their economy, to the war effort, right, was because of false U.S. satellite data given to Iraq and key U.S. weapons sold to Iran, right? So do you think that's going to piss off Iraq? You think they're going to want to get some payback and maybe want to prevent the U.S. from screwing them again like that in the future? You know, without a doubt. Now, May 5th, 1987, that's when the Senate hearings on Iran-Contra begin. Ronald Reagan, the president, Secretary of State Schultz, Secord, Poindexter, Oliver North, all these guys are being dragged before the bar and required to testify. So essentially the Reagan administration is on trial. The Reagan administration is in a highly vulnerable position. Okay? So this would be an opportune time for Saddam Hussein to try to get some payback. And so let's see what happens here. All right, so May 13th, May 17th, Iraq had been flying an attack profile. I was in the Persian Gulf. All right, shortly after this, this incident occurred where a U.S. ship called the USS Stark was hit by a French-built Exocet missile fired from a French-built Mirage F-1 Mirage. All right. So they would fly. When I was in the Persian Gulf, they would fly this flight profile like clockwork. Typical flight profile was 3 F-1 built Mirages flying information, flying southeast across the Persian Gulf to Farsi Island. We called it the Farsi Hook because what they would do is they would then make a sharp turn to the northeast and launch Exocet missiles at Iranian tankers coming out of their main oil export ports at Bushehr and Karg Island. Karg Island is a little bit northwest of Bushehr. When I was in the Persian Gulf, we called this the Farsi Hook, and they flew it almost nightly. All right, uncontested by Iran. They would just put up. What did they do? They put up diversions, radar enhancing decoys to attract missiles instead of getting hit by ships and stuff like that. All right, so let's see here. Here is Bushehr, right? Karg Island is just up there a little bit. Farsi Island is right around there. So here I have, that's Farsi Island. Here's Bushehr, right? And they would fly down a flight of 3 F-1 Mirages, come around Farsi Island, they will hook up here. That's why we called it the hook. And they get a better attack profile coming in from the southwest, heading northeast here, and they would launch their Exocet missiles and fly back. All right. So that's what they typically did. Now, this is what happened, all right? Iraq had designated a line of latitude 29 degrees 30 minutes separating a prohibited war zone to the north and neutral safe waters to the south. All right. I first learned of this when I was on the U.S. command ship of the Joint Task Force. Admiral Less was in command of all U.S. forces in the Persian Gulf, be it Air Force, Marine Corps, Navy, whatever, right? I was on ship's company, but we got intelligence briefings from the Admiral's staff, one of which was on the U.S. Stark attack, right? And then I remember this very clearly, right? Very accurately. And all this was then confirmed when I read the official U.S. Navy report on the incident. That's a published report. Now, what happened on the 13th and 14th of May, Iraq changed its attack profile, and they flew close to the coast, south of the 2730 North Lake Detect line, right? And on May 17th, an Iraqi F-1 fired 2 Exocet missiles into the USS Stark at position, coordinates, right? Killing 37 U.S. sailors. All right, so this is their nightly attack profile. This is like clockwork. They're doing this, right? The Farsi hook. Then, instead of flying across the Persian Gulf to Farsi Island, hooking up here, they're flying right along the coast, right? And well south for 2 nights in a row, right? Then a couple days later, they again fly well south, and they put 2 Exocet missiles right there. This is where the Stark was hit, right? By 2 French-built Exocet missiles. And, okay, position Stark attacked, right? Here's the Lake Detect line, right? And here's the USS Stark. Both missiles went in here, the forward part of the superstructure here. The first missile blew up, and the second missile, the warhead did not detonate it, but, of course, the remaining fuel blew, right, creating a lot of damage. All right, and to the credit of U.S. naval ship builders, we took 2 hits of surface-to-ship missiles, and the ship survived. The British Sheffield during the Falklands War took 1 Exocet missile and sank. All right. Now, May 19th. So almost immediately after, both the State Department and the Pentagon immediately issued public statements that they believe it was an accident. I remember all this. I remember reading the newspaper and I read Tariq Aziz's complaint in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and then I went back when I prepared this and I reread that article online, and I remembered almost exactly, right? So when there's something important, for me, it sticks in my head with pretty good accuracy. Now, May 19th, I remember watching the news and watching the statements by the State Department and the Pentagon, right, where they believe it's an accident. And I remember being shocked, it was just like jaw-dropping, like, what? It's only been a day. How do they come out and claim it's an accident, right, without any investigation? How do they know? So then my first thought was, well, we're just supporting our ally, Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein's our ally, so we're just, we're supporting him. That's probably what we're doing, right? All right. And then I started thinking, and I put 2 and 2 together. It wasn't that difficult, right? It was like, wait a minute, One, we had just screwed our ally, Iraq, bad, giving them false intelligence on the location of Iranian armies. They know that, right? And then we give their enemy key weapons for an effective ground offensive. They know that too. They didn't know that we gave the Iranians intelligence, but they know these 2 things, right? In November 1986, information comes out that we sold Iran critical weapons for an armored ground offensive, TOW and Hawk, right? So Iraq knows we screwed them twice, all right? These combined were key to a major Iranian victory in which Iran takes Iraq's Faw Peninsula, their only access to the Persian Gulf, their only way of shipping out oil. And oil is the basis of their economy and the basis of their means of financing their war. So they're screwed, right? Starting on May 5th, 1987, the Reagan administration is on trial, Right, so this is the start of the Iran-Contra hearings. They're on trial for the illegal sale of weapons to Iran, right? With a bogus things. Oh, we're trying to get out hostages, right? Yeah, right, right. Oh, trying to get money for the Contras. Yeah, right, right. Oh, Iraq is winning. No, they weren't, right? So the Reagan administration is on the hot seat and vulnerable to attack, right? So they're vulnerable right now. They can't say jack, right? Now, 8 days later, Iraq changes their attack profile. On May 13th and May 14th, then 12 days after the hearings start, they hit a U.S. warship with 2 missiles, killing 37 U.S. boys. Right? That's on May 17th. Okay, I showed you the pictures of that. Right? Now, we immediately responded. The attack was an accident before any investigation, and I was literally just jaw-dropping, incredulous. Like, what? Right? I'm willing to bet most people are eating their dinner like, okay, all right, blah blah blah. Not even paying attention. Right? But I couldn't believe it. All right. So now there are 2 possibilities. 1, it could have been an accident. All right. So that's a possibility. 2, it was intentional. There's no in between. So if it was intentional, though, there had to have been a motive, and that motive points directly back to the Iran-Contra, wrongdoing, right, for which the Reagan administration is currently on trial before all the world to see. So if the Reagan administration claims it was intentional, then they would incriminate themselves and bear responsibility for the 37 U.S. boys killed, right? They want no part of that blame, so they rush to claim it's an accident, right? And that's the way it goes down in history. That's an example of how history is made. But let's take a look at this like any good cop would do. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. Just be a cop. Any good cop would do this, right? Iraq had clear. They would look for motive. Iraq had clear motive. We screwed them bad with false intelligence to Iraq and also selling key weapons to Iran. Right? That helped them in their ground offensive. They want retaliation, but also deterrence. Right? They don't want the U.S. to screw them again. Right? So this would be payback. It's payback for getting them, but it's also like, hey, don't even try this again because we'll just get you again like this. Right? Now, Iraq had the perfect opportunity. The Reagan administration was on trial and thus vulnerable. They couldn't say anything or they would incriminate themselves and thus assume blame for the 37 dead U.S. sailors. 37 U.S. boys dead. They don't want any of that, right? Now, Iraq took extraordinary measures, crossing well into designated neutral waters far southwest of their typical attack profile. They're skirting the shoreline to evade detection for 3 nights, then firing 2 missiles into a U.S. warship. All right, so do you think this was an accident? I mean, give me a break. They had motive. They had extraordinary opportunity. They took extraordinary means. So it looks like the purpose was payback and deterrence to prevent this from happening again. All right, we're going to stop there. We'll continue with the follow-on of what happened. But let's do a quick review here. Well, we'll just continue with the next lecture. I'll pick it up at how Iraq compensated for the loss of the Fall Peninsula.